Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, we're going to try something a little different. We will explore another topic on which we have already done an episode. Yeah, we're going back to colonial America. Hang on. There are so many aspects of everything we look at. If we exhaustively explored all of them in every podcast, including this look, which is a look at Benjamin Franklin, they would last for hours and you would just shut us off.
In some weird way, I might like that. What more can we say about Lime Coke, for
Oh, I
example?
have no doubt that you could say a great deal about that, but this is not our subject for this podcast, Dr. Deneen.
Probably just as well. No, my friends, our subject is Dr. Benjamin Franklin, whose skills in romance and diplomacy we've already covered. Please give that podcast a like and a listen if you haven't already. Today, we're going to look at the man we call Benny's talents as an inventor.
Indeed. Franklin's talents in creating new devices have passed beyond reality into the stuff of legend, some of which is mythology, most of which is true, actually. From the lightning rod to bifocals to odometers, lots of things. His hand seems to be in 70% of the new ideas discovered during his 8-decade life.
This is even satirized in my favorite film, the historical musical 1776. John Adams sings, Franklin did this, and Franklin did that, and Franklin did some other damn thing. Franklin smote the ground, and out sprang George Washington, fully grown and on his horse. Franklin electrified Washington with his miraculous lightning rod, and the three of them, Franklin, Washington, and the horse, conducted the entire revolution all alone.
Well, thank God, the truth is more subtle. Most of Franklin's inventions were a practical form of problem solving. He would see a need and he would fill it. This is a pattern that began during his childhood. 3 of his most famous inventions directly responded to grave problems suffered by himself or his loved ones. I'm referring here to swim fins, bifocals, and a more comfortable catheter.
To fully understand the circumstances which made this man a giant of history capable of giant errors as well as great inventions, it's essential to look at the world he came from. Ken Burns' brilliant documentary does a first-rate job of looking at Franklin's origins. He was born in Boston on January 17th, 1706, as one of 15 children. At the time of Franklin's birth, 15 years after the infamous Salem witch trials, Calvinist Puritans largely dominated Massachusetts. If you haven't seen that, friends, check out our podcast on the witch trials. Josiah Franklin, Benjamin's father, often brought people of all intellectual viewpoints to his home, engaging in dinner table and parlor debates on everything from the proper diet to the possibility of human free will. Josiah believed young Benjamin might have a talent for the Calvinist ministry, so he sent him to school, even though his education only lasted formally 2 years. And it was during this formative period of childhood and adolescence that Franklin designed his first invention, the swim fins we had aforementioned.
The writing of Dr. H.W. Brands, head of the University of Texas History Department, details 11-year-old Franklin's efforts to support his arms while swimming. In Franklin's own words, they were more effective with his arms than legs. He said, "When I was a boy, I made 2 oval pallets, each about 10 inches long and 6 broad, with a hole for the thumb in order to retain it in the palm of my hand. They much resemble a painter's palettes. In swimming, I pulled the edges of these forward, and I struck the water with their flat surfaces as I drew them back. I remember I swam faster by means of these pallets, but they fatigued my wrists, and I also fitted these pallets to the soles of my feet, a kind of sandals. But I was not satisfied with them because I observed that the stroke is not effective. Now, I got to say, Franklin blew it on this one because swim fins that attach to the feet are far more efficient, effective, and they're used today. The hand pallets that he refers to, they don't work very well. They simply don't. But, okay, so he blew it on this one. He didn't on a whole lot of others. At any rate, the pallets were entirely his device, although Leonardo da Vinci, had drawn something similar nearly 2 centuries earlier. When Franklin turned 12, he was apprenticed to his older brother James as a printer's assistant. Franklin was exposed to ideas and books covering many ideas in many areas. The information he was exposed to enabled him to become educated in the areas that he chose to become educated in. By the age of 16, he was running a secret advice column under the pseudonym of Silence Dogood. And Franklin suggested that this person was a widow with a high reputation. The advice was given on every conceivable subject from cooking to funeral arrangements.
This was sort of an 18th century version of Hints from Heloise. Now, Franklin could have gotten in serious trouble because he undertook this column on the sly with no permission from James, who had no idea it was he initially, but was furious that somebody was daring to use his typesetting equipment at night. Suspecting Ben had broken his very stern commands, James repeatedly chastised his brother, first verbally and then physically whipping him for getting out of his place. Now, this is despite the fact that Ben had come to James's rescue, running the print shop entirely on his own at the age of 16 for 6 months in 1722, when James had been in prison for writing a libelous editorial attacking famous preacher Cotton Mather. James Franklin's temper got so out of hand on one occasion, he whipped his younger brother Ben into unconsciousness. After a year and a half of almost daily beatings and harsh treatment, Ben could endure no more and ran away with only 2 loaves of bread and 2 British shillings, which is about 50 cents in today's money, in his pockets, finding a new self-directed life for himself in Philadelphia. Now, let me just say briefly, these sort of apprentices were like indentured servants. It was basically slavery for a time period. But Ben had, in gratitude for his welcome, he made a conscious decision to want to improve conditions in all aspects of his home city. He found work again as a printer, spent the next 20 years making contacts, and in his own words, thinking about how he could do well by doing good. He went into printing partnerships with former employees of his own in South Carolina, Delaware, New Hampshire, and even Nassau in the Bahamas. Years of experience in the printing trade helped Franklin to discover, over a century before anyone else did, the impact that repeated exposure to lead could have on health. Some printers lost the ability to use their hands, others even died. His concern over repeated fires caused Franklin to help create the first fire department in Pennsylvania in December of 1736. This had been a joint project of Franklin himself and future Philadelphia District Attorney William Rawle. Rawle was at that time a very prosperous man running provisioners, similar to our friend Caesar Drake we did another podcast on. But there's a very important thing about this fire company, a difference rather, this fire company and similar ones in New York and in Boston at the time. The Pennsylvania group assists everybody. Other fire companies, you had to subscribe, and if your house was on fire and you hadn't paid up, you were out of luck. But Franklin's interest in international printing spurs him to do a number of things. He figures out how to monitor weather patterns, map the Gulf Stream, and view the aurora borealis, the legendary northern lights. He had a hypothesis: the Earth had a negative charge and the northern lights had a very positive charge. The combination of these two charges interacting with moisture in the atmosphere produced the lights which we call the aurora borealis. Franklin had a passionate commitment to education. He helps finance through subscription the University of Pennsylvania. But he wants to make access to ideas and education universal. This leads to what he himself regards as his greatest public contribution. That's the world's first public library. Books were required from all over Europe and the United Kingdom, and members paid a fee of 5 shillings, approximately 85 cents in our money, per year as membership. I'm very glad I didn't exist in that time. I would probably still owe them the 5 shillings. But many people have wondered what inspired Franklin to create this library.
Hmm. I'm sure you don't mean that you wouldn't have willingly paid the shillings, just that you would have forgotten. Anyhow, the idea to create a library came from his experience in London in the 1720s when the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania sent him over to Europe to deliver some important documents. To his horror, upon arrival, he found that his promised letters of introduction had not been sent. These were vital to be received in the right houses. He further discovered that he had yet to receive letters of credit, which were supposed to finance his trip. So he had to support himself by reading books to illiterate folk on the street. This series of events brought home to him the unpleasant truth that most people didn't have access to non-religious books. He would make 8 trips to the United Kingdom throughout his life, often interacting with some of the most brilliant Enlightenment figures. In 1750, for example, he was corresponding with Voltaire. 5 years later, Franklin spent a summer with economist Adam Smith and philosopher David Hume. This is where Franklin acquired his economic ideas. The two Europeans admired Franklin very much. Hume referred to Franklin as the modern Prometheus for his work on the lightning rod. Adam Smith regarded Franklin as the sage of North America. Franklin's interest in lightning came about after many church steeples were damaged by lightning strikes in the early 1740s. In 1747, after 2 years of experiments in his laboratory-style milk barn, Franklin decided to prove his theory that lightning was an electrical discharge and took his experimenting outside during a lightning storm. This line of thought led him to conduct the famous kite in a storm experiment, in which he flew a kite with a metal key attached to the string. When lightning struck near the kite, he got a shock, actually more like a tingle, indicating that lightning is an electrical discharge as he had hypothesized. Franklin went on to speculate that the destructive discharge of lightning, which occurs when lightning strikes an object such as a building, could be diverted into the ground, thus preserving the structure of the building. The only witness to this experiment was William Franklin, Benjamin's son, from whom he would become estranged, and the last royal governor of New Jersey. Despite the split, William never publicly or privately claimed that the experiment had not occurred. Benjamin Franklin's interest in electricity led him to work with the Leyden box, an apparatus that could hold an electrical charge. He found that by using a charged Leyden box to shock people suffering from spasticity or partial paralysis, he could give these people some short-term relief. Now, just to explain, there's some confusion about the lightning rod. The rod was pointed, which was very, very important, and it rose above where the building that it was fastened to was. And there was a wire going from the lightning rod down to a rod that was embedded in the ground. Therefore, when the lightning would hit it, the charge would be transmitted into the earth, and that way it did not damage the building.
That level of shock being used to bring about temporary relief, since I have spastic cerebral palsy, it reminds me of my TENS unit treatments, which limited my pain, particularly back in the 90s. That particular TENS device was developed by a Jesuit priest, Father Sebastian Knipe, someone I'd like to do a podcast on in the future, perhaps. But Franklin's electrical work had indeed caused him to discover and name negative and positive charges. He had an extremely profound mind and wide-ranging interests. He constantly struggled to increase his understanding of the environment around him, which led him to study many phenomena and gave rise to many inventions. For example, he read a lot, and in those days it was thought voracious reading caused your eyesight to decline. After repeatedly shifting between glasses designed for either problems with nearsight or farsight, Franklin applied his genius to creating bifocals. Jacob Bronsky's wonderful scientific book, The Ascent of Man, details Franklin's work in this vital area of vision. Dr. Franklin had the top of each lens cut in half and placed in the frame together. The distance halves were on the top. The eye lens loses flexibility as people age. Dr. Bronsky called bifocals the most important medical invention prior to 1900, but it was a personal family crisis that created Franklin's next great invention.
And what was that?
Well, Ben's older brother John was suffering severely from kidney stones. Now, this is an era without sedatives or any kind of anesthetic, so the idea of surgery is just too painful. Catheters were made of metal rods, and they were almost unbearably painful. So Ben designed a new type of catheter with hinges, providing some flexibility and making the insertion of the catheter into the urethra less painful. Because he was a postmaster, he became interested in the most efficient and quickest ways to deliver the mail. To do this properly, he needed to determine the shortest and quickest routes. Timing the deliveries was easy, but he needed to invent an odometer to measure the distance of deliveries accurately. The mechanism he came up with was elegant and very simple, and present-day odometers use very similar methods. He devised a way to count the revolutions a wagon wheel made on the delivery run, from which simple arithmetic could be used to calculate mileage. His love of music also proved the source of another great experiment. The R monicum, notice I'm pronouncing the A, was an improvement on London invention where different musical notes were played on glasses, the sound varying depending on how much water was in the glass. His version was far more sophisticated. The glasses were arranged according to size. Franklin contracted with a glass blower in London. Each bowl was tuned to a different note. Some designed for sharper noises were filled with cork, and each bowl was color-coded. Holes were drilled and an iron rod was put through the holes. The rod attached to a wheel and foot pedals moved each bowl. Wet fingers moved to the edge and start and touch the bowls, producing what Franklin's common law wife, Deborah, called the music of the angels. This device took off like a rocket. Mozart produced pieces for it. The Speaker of the Irish Parliament purchased and placed three of them in the public gallery. And Beethoven himself wrote what he called a light composition for it. Franklin played the device for the rest of his days with no difficulty, although it lost popularity after his death because some players experienced dizziness, involuntary spasms, and muscle cramps. In Bavaria, in the early 1800s, a child died after a concert. Some have blamed the lead paint. Others believe that the high pitched music had delivered the audience into what was called apoplexy, some sort of stress reaction. As with all of Franklin's inventions, he refused any patents, declaring it his duty to repay the blessings given to him by both the nation and the great inventors of the past. As he is written over the door of the Philadelphia Franklin Institute, as we enjoy the advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of any opportunity to serve others through any invention of ours. And colonial Pennsylvania folks had many other needs, which the ambitious Dr. Franklin would continue to attempt to supply.
Franklin was also the first to determine the link between contact and colds. Most people, and particularly in that day and even to this day, thought that colds were caused by people being wet or exposed to cold temperatures, thus the term cold for the condition. Franklin realized that sailors were often wet and exposed to temperature changes, but rarely came down with colds. He reasoned that colds didn't come about by getting wet or cold, but by interacting with others who were ill. Franklin became interested in why ice fell during hot weather, which does seem a little bizarre. After some study and speculation, he hypothesized that temperatures become colder at higher altitudes, meaning that moisture in the upper atmosphere froze into the hail that falls to Earth. He, of course, has been proven to be quite correct in that hypothesis. Benjamin Franklin was an autodidact, meaning self taught. He studied such giants of science as Aristotle, Alhazen, Galileo, and Newton, and a whole bunch of others too, and followed the scientific method in making his inventions and increasing his understanding of the world. In brief, the scientific method includes 6 or 7 steps, depending on how they are divided. The steps are: 1, ask a question. Now, that doesn't just mean, oh, something kind of ridiculous, but it means asking a question that sometimes you have to formulate the question in a different way than what many people do. And we often go about today making assumptions. This or that happens in the world, and we don't question why, how, when. We just say, yeah, it happens. But that's not what Franklin did. He asked a question like, why is ice falling out of the sky in the heat of summer? All right. Why does the catheter hurt my brother so badly? And the reason is because it wasn't flexible. So the question that you ask is very critical. Secondly, do some background research. Don't just back up 50 feet and run at a brick wall and hope to knock down some bricks. It won't happen. You will end up on your back. You need to look at what other people have done and understand that research. Now, you also can ask questions about that research, which is called peer review. Okay. Question, always question. Next, make a hypothesis. Now, that's very important. You base your hypothesis on the question and the background research that you have done. Now, the next and critical state, test the hypothesis with an experiment when possible. Now, of course, certain things do not easily lend themselves to doing an experiment, but when it's possible, do it. When we were looking at tipping points in history, now we could not go back and change history so we could see the effect of what changes made. But we were able to look at those tipping points throughout history and see that where they were present, these things happened. So our hypothesis, though not definitively proven, have been statistically verified. And yes, further research needs to be done. Yes. And until we invent a time machine where we can go back and do real experimentation, we won't, maybe no. The fifth step is to analyze the data collected in the experiment and make conclusions. Okay, now that doesn't mean we're going to prove what we thought, what we hypothesized in the first place. Disconfirming an hypothesis is quite nearly as important as proving a hypothesis. It is not shameful to have an incorrect hypothesis. What is shameful is covering up the truth. That is important. And Franklin realized this. He was pretty scrupulous about it. Then the next step is communicate the results and seek peer reviews. Now, what does that mean? Well, not only do you share the information, but you seek out people who might disagree, people who might be experts, people who might agree, and get their opinions. Take it into consideration. Peer review is very important. Now, I believe that Franklin applied the scientific mindset and most of the methodology when he helped invent the new Republic of the USA.
By the 1770s, William Franklin, his father's beloved son, was the royal governor of New Jersey. Benjamin himself was the deputy postmaster for Pennsylvania. He was also in charge of printing paper money for Delaware, New Jersey, and New Hampshire. He was what was called a colonial agent for those three mid-Atlantic colonies. That's a person who represents the interests of a colony in the royal court of George III as well as in the parliament.
You know, Benjamin, he spent a very comfortable time, very comfortable life he had in the UK. He was at that time only partially aware of the crisis building back home in the US of A, or what was to become the US of A. And you know that makes sense. The communication was not what it is today, and he was getting information secondhand at best. So he didn't really know. As early as the 1750s, during the French and Indian War, Franklin advocated American nobility and colonial unity with the Albany Union Plan. His service as postmaster and frequent travels in a time in which entire generations never traveled more than 20 miles from their home had exposed Franklin to a larger world. He remained passionately devoted to the ideals of king and empire. He believed that the colonists could and should work together with the British. Many British aristocrats saw Franklin as the source of everything positive and negative in the life of America. As Americans started down the path toward war and independence, he was vilified and hailed at the same time. After the Boston Tea Party, William Pitt the Elder, Lord Chatham, sought out Franklin to write a speech of conciliation, which would ask the king, who still possessed power in the government in those days, to grant Americans representation either in Parliament or through a colonial wide elected Continental Congress. Franklin wrote his lordship's speech, which was delivered to a packed House of Commons in June 1774. The speech writing and delivery is detailed in Jeff Shara's two-novel history of the Revolution, Rise to the Revolution and the Glorious Cause are the titles. And in that, he quotes Franklin saying, "My lords, we can no longer treat the settlers in North America as children. By the dint of a lot of hard work, they have grown into blessed manhood. His Majesty is no tyrant. He desires not craven fear, but honorable loyalty. Having attained to the status of men, their voices deserve to be heard in the sacred councils of the empire."
But it was not to be. The House of Commons approved the idea, but the House of Lords saw it as the indulgence of spoiled whelps, children, to quote Sir John Montagu, the Earl of Sandwich, for which that wonderful food is named. Montagu had been a personal enemy of Franklin's, humiliating him at the beginning of 1774 by accusing him of stealing the private letters of his former friend turned enemy, Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Being dismissed at every turn and having the last attempt at compromise defeated, Franklin had had enough. As he said in his autobiography, when that bill went down to defeat, I understood there could be no more equivocation. I had crossed the Rubicon.
With the insight Franklin gained from the king rejecting any compromise, Benjamin Franklin's life turned around completely, did a 180. He committed himself to helping to create and foster the new republic and breaking the chain of colonialism enacted by the British Empire.
Benjamin Franklin, turning against the king, put him in direct opposition to his son William, who remained a passionate loyalist. Defining principle of Franklin's existence is his constant, passionate efforts to change and improve everything around him. He possessed some spark of inner fire that would not enable him to do anything with less than 100% dedication.
Franklin's quest for knowledge and understanding carried him through many phases of his life, from childhood, which included emotional and physical abuse, through all the changes in his adulthood. As you say, Dr. Doneen, Franklin committed himself completely to the acquisition of knowledge and the causes he felt were worthy. He consistently did this, even at the risk of losing his life during the Revolution, for example. Yes, he had his failings. And as has been said, great people frequently have great failings.
We really do hope you've enjoyed this podcast. We've had some nice ones in the past few weeks and more to come. Please take the time to give us a like, make a comment, join the podcast if you haven't. There's many wonderful things coming up. We thank you and we really appreciate it.
Indeed, we do. And thanks for tuning in today. And hopefully you'll tune in again. And, it would be really helpful if you would give us a like, subscribe, make a comment. It would be helpful to us and let us know what's on your mind and what you're thinking. And we do appreciate that very much. So for now, we bid you adieu.
So long, friends.